Welcome to an introduction to forces. Forces are part of every bit of physics, pretty much. I mean, even the stuff we've been working with kinematics. Even though we hadn't done forces yet, forces are what cause things to move. And so forces are really the most important part of physics at every level, whether it's introductory or it's the high energy physics that uses the huge CERN supercolliders. So forces are central to everything that you do in this semester of physics and the next semester of physics. So grab your notebook, and I want you to stop, write down a couple things that come to mind when you hear the word force. So do that. All right, so what did you come up with? When most people hear the word force, the words that are going to come up in their head are things like pushes and pulls and perhaps Star Wars and Yoda, if you're like me. But pushes and pulls are probably one of the easiest ways to think about forces, because they are forces. Forces are interactions between two objects. And so a push, I push on the glass, I can push on the marker. Pushes and pulls are one of the most basic types of forces, and you have a lot of experience with them. You also have a lot of experience with other forces that are less obvious, let's say. I'm standing on the floor right now. What's keeping me from floating away? Well, you probably say gravity. And yeah, there is a force due to gravity, which is kind of interesting because what causes gravity? We're going to talk about that in a minute. So there's a force of gravity. You know, if I'm leaning on a wall, what's holding me up? Well, the wall is. The wall is exerting a force on me. So there's all sorts of types of forces. One of the hard things about this unit is that your daily experience has taught you some things about forces that aren't true physics-wise. And so there are a lot of questions I'm going to be asking you and concepts to think about that are counterintuitive. So be patient in this unit. Be patient with yourself, be patient with me, be patient with physics. And don't worry if you get them wrong, because your day-to-day experience is going to say, well, this is what's true. And then I'm going to come along and say, well, actually not. So be patient with this unit. Just because you get the answer wrong doesn't mean that you are wrong and that you're bad at physics. No, you're just saying, well, this is what my experience has told me. So keep that in mind when you're going through this unit. So we're going to write down some ideas of forces, types of forces. But the thing that I want you to keep in mind is that every time you see the word force, what I want you to associate with the word force is the word interaction. Forces are interactions between two objects. You can't have a force with one object only. Every time you say this is a force, you have to be able to think a force of what on what. So it's always force of A on B. A does something to B. You can never have the force of A on nothing. That's not a force, because forces are always interactions between two objects. So let's think about different types of forces we might encounter. So pushes and pulls, absolutely. They're going to be, just kind of applied forces. So pushes and pulls, applied forces, that's got to be common. You experience those all the time. You push your chair, you push your pencil around. What other types of forces can you come up with? What else might we experience? I already mentioned one. Gravity. Can you get gravity? And the force of gravity is actually what we're going to call weight. The force of gravity is weight. And it's the earth pulling on us. Remember, forces are interactions between two objects. If you say, well, there's a force of gravity, and I say, well, what causes gravity? And you say, well, gravity, that's not a force. You have to always say what the physical object is that's causing that force. In the case of gravity, it's the earth. The earth itself is pulling us downward. And the cool thing is that we're also pulling upwards on the earth. So gravity, which we're going to call weight, What else? Well, other things you might have encountered, you can hang stuff by a wire, you can hang stuff by a ribbon, a rope, dental floss, whatever. So those rope type forces, we give the name tension. So we're going to call that tension. And that, it's not just ropes, but anything like that, you know, chains, dental floss, ribbons, anything like that. That kind of pulling of a long, skinny object that you might tie to something, that's going to be a tension force. What else do you encounter in your day-to-day world? What helps you walk? What makes you walk? It's an interaction with the ground. If the ground's not there, you're not walking. And what else do you need in order to be able to walk? Well, we live in Wisconsin, and in the middle of winter, you might have found yourself slipping a little bit and finding it hard to walk. And that's when it's icy. What does that lead you to think? Hopefully, you're thinking about friction. So friction is another type of force. And friction is an interaction between just two objects that are in contact with each other. So two objects in contact with each other. Tension is a rope on something. Weight is the earth on something. Pushes and pulls are applied objects, A on B. What else do we have? Well, okay. Now we've got basic pushing. Now, what is holding up this little, whatever it is? And you say the box. Great. What's holding up the box? Me. What's holding up me? The ground. There's a series of supporting forces. So there's a support force anytime you have something being pushed on. And with that, it's also a contact force. But don't think about it just in terms of up-down, because this is a reaction force or a supporting force. It's a reaction to some squishing, some pushing between two objects. So if I push on the wall, then the wall pushes back on me. The two objects are me and the wall. And there's that supporting force. The wall is pushing on me this way. I'm pushing that way on the wall. And this force, this kind of reaction force, is called the normal force, which is, I know, kind of a weird word, but it's taken from the math. And the interesting thing about the normal force is that it is always perpendicular to the surface. And that's why it's called normal, because that normal word means perpendicular to the surface. So there are a couple others. Take a minute and see if you can come up with other types of forces. See if there's anything else around the house that you might say, is this interacting? So give it a minute. Resistance, magnet, static electricity. All right, could you come up with any more? I'm going to list some. You might have come up with others. So on my fridge, I have a lot of these things from various travels. Oops, hopefully I didn't break it. So from my travels, I like to collect these little souvenirs. And of course on the back, to make them stick to the fridge, is a magnet. Now, the two magnets will, as you know, stick to each other. So there. And that is another type of force. So we have the magnetic force. And so the force of a magnet on something else is another type of force. And if you've ever tried to take your laundry out of the dryer in the middle of winter when it's really dry, you might have noticed that your socks are sticking to your sweatpants. And what's that? That's another type of force. And that we're going to call just the static electricity force. And I've got a kitty joining me. So static electricity. What else do we have? Well, we're going to ignore this most of the time, but, can't drop it right now. You know, if I drop these two things, they're not going to fall at the same rate. Why? Okay, watch out, Jeeves. What caused the sticker to fall more slowly than the brush? You know that. It's air resistance. we're good in physics about ignoring these sticky things like air resistance. Do you really have to come up right now? Okay. So we're good about ignoring air resistance, and unless it has to be there to make the problem make sense, we will be ignoring it. So here's some, and now there's two different categories that these forces are falling into. One category is, let's see, this one, and this one. Those three are one category, and then the others, so this one, normal, and air resistance. That is another type. Give yourself a minute, see if you can come up with what's different between these three and the rest of them. See if you can say what is different between those two. Okay, did you figure it out? It is whether or not it requires contact. So pushes and pulls require the two objects to be in contact. I'm contacting the cat right now. However, when I drop something, so let's just drop the marker, it doesn't require contact with the earth to fall. So gravity, force of gravity, which we're going to call weight, is a non-contact, what we're going to call a long-range force. Rope requires, tension requires contact, friction requires contact. The normal force, I mentioned it was a reaction to two things being squished together. That is a contact force. The magnetic force, well, you probably have had the experience of two magnets being closer and closer, and all of a sudden, whoop, they don't have to be in contact to be attracted to each other. Static electricity, same thing. That's a long-range force. Air resistance requires contact with the air. So those are all the different types of contact forces and then long-range forces. So those are just some basic introductions to forces, and it's going to be so important for the rest of the semester that this starts to make sense to you. So spend some time, but again, be patient, because it can be very counterintuitive, some of the things that we're going to learn. But what I want you to keep in mind all the time, if it's a force, it's an interaction between two objects. That is the most important thing to know about forces. If you can keep that in mind, it's going to make a lot more sense for everything else, particularly Newton's third law. And that's what we're going to be moving into next, Newton's three laws, and then how to draw what we're going to call force diagrams or free body diagrams. So that's coming up, but here is your introduction to forces. I hope it makes sense.